So hello, everyone. Welcome to this IUCN WCPA Vital Sites event, Understanding the Role of Protected Areas as Nature-Based Solutions, part one of a two-part series.
So good morning, good afternoon and evening to everyone, depending on your location. Welcome also from my part to discuss how protected and conserved areas contribute to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. My name is Marianne Kettunen, and I'll be moderating us through the discussion today. And just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a policy expert. I have worked on a wide range of biodiversity-related issues over the past 15 years. I'm a member of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, WCPA, and I also work with issues related to rangers, supporting the Thin Green Line Foundation UK in an advisory role. So, what is on the agenda for today? In the upcoming 1.5 hours, you'll be hearing us making the case and also providing evidence for the case that if governments, businesses, and other relevant stakeholders want to be serious about maintaining Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs for short, they need to start looking at the sustainability benefits provided by protected and conserved areas. Of course, protected and conserved areas are supported by their own SDGs, which aim to conserve life on land and underwater. These are the SDGs 14 and 15. But as you will hear today, protected and conserved areas play a much bigger role on the 2030 agenda as they underpin the delivery of over half of all the SDGs. And at the same time, as we all well know, protected and conserved areas are increasingly being put under pressure. So we need to step up our efforts to be much more systematic, much more explicit, and much more vocal about the role that protected and conserved areas play in delivering SDGs. And we also need to find ways how to translate these SDG benefits into direct financial returns. These kinds of returns that can both help the management of the protected and conserved areas and also support communities living in and around these areas. So this webinar aims to do just that. It is the first discussion in the series of 2 Vital Site webinars, both of which are aimed at giving the listeners, you over there, concrete resources and tools to identify and to articulate, to assess, and also to advocate for protected areas and conserved areas as concrete tools for delivering sustainability in practice. So our 3 speakers today, to whom I'm going to hand over very soon, will be presenting you information and key resources that is available currently in this space that will help you to understand how our protected areas, conserved areas play a role in delivering SDGs. How we're going to be running through today's session, we'll be starting with 2 presentations, and then we'll be stopping for Q&A. And then we will be continuing with our 3rd presentation, and again, after that, have a Q&A session at the end. So to recap, we'll be having 2 Q&A sessions. So audience out there, please feel free to use the webinar's QA function to ask questions. Those questions will be visible for all of you, so you can also vote for some questions to be taken up if you agree with them. And we'll be trying to pick up those questions in the Q&A session, and also trying to respond to them in writing as we go. So please use the Q&A function of the webinar to chat with us. You can also use a chat function, but it will be much easier if you reserve the chat function only for sharing resources and information that you just want to put out there, but you don't have an actual question to ask. So both are available, but easier for us if you Q&A in the Q&A section of the webinar. So that's it in all its simplicity. I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. And without further delay, I'm going to hand over to the first speaker, who is Nigel Dudley. So Nigel, the floor is yours. And if I could just kindly ask you first to introduce yourself and then lead us through to the first presentation of today. Nigel, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Mariana. I'm Nigel Dudley, based here in the UK. Mariana and I were co-chairs of a group called Natural Solutions in the World Commission on Protected Areas for many years. What I'm talking about this afternoon comes out of that group. I'm also a freelance consultant working on a wide range of issues, but with a big focus on protected areas. So I'm going to share my screen now and give a short presentation. Can everyone see? Is that good? Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm talking about work that we've done on the role of protected and conserved areas in delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. And when I say protected and conserved areas, I'm talking both about official state protected areas like national parks, nature reserves, but also community-run protected areas, and this other developing privately protected areas, areas run by companies, by religious groups, but also this emerging new category of other effective area-based conservation measures, which are a form of conservation where the main aim, the management aim, is not aimed at conservation, but the way the land or water is managed delivers conservation. And this is a relatively new designation recognized by the Convention on Biological Diversity that is being unrolled around the world. And as many of you will know, there's a draft target that by 2030, we will try and get 30% of the world's land area and ocean area into protected and conserved areas. That's a huge jump up. When I first started working on these issues, the idea we'd have even 5% of the world's surface in protected areas would seem like an impossible dream. So there's a huge change in the last few decades. But I think it's very clear, even if that target gets agreed, and we're not sure it will do, but at least 80 countries have said they're committed to it. So whether the CBD agrees it or not, there's a kind of momentum among many countries. But to get the civil society backing for that, we can't just rely on wildlife anymore. We need to also look at ecosystem services, at services for people, at the broader range of benefits from a natural system. And to do that, we also got a little bit of a paradox that civil society, most people who don't think about this stuff all the time, they very quickly recognize when we lose an ecosystem service, when there's flooding, when water becomes dirty, when we lose soil. But it's much more difficult to explain what an ecosystem service, the value of the service when it's there, because it tends to be something that people take for granted. Flood control, clean water, stable mountainsides. We take them for granted. We don't realize there's a real value for them. So part of what we've been doing within the World Commission on Protected Areas for many years, working with partners such as WWF, the World Bank, is to look at the wider benefits from protected areas, looking at all the way from drinking water through faith groups, the role of sacred natural sites, impacts on poverty reduction, disaster risk reduction. And I think we can say that we've pretty much won the intellectual argument that this is real benefits. But what we haven't done yet is really translate that on a broad scale to what governments do and how governments react. We've got lots of nice case studies, but it hasn't scaled up on the level that we might have hoped. The Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals that Mariana referred to, with a 2030 deadline, they give us an opportunity to bring these issues into the mainstream, because the Sustainable Development Goals are not just about conservation. They're about a whole bunch of different societal aims, and they are having a direct impact on government policy and on corporate policy. So they provide us with an extra lever to bring these ideas into the mainstream. We're hearing from Hannah Timmins later. Hannah and I did a study for a European government pension fund recently. We looked at about 1,800 companies looking at biodiversity risks from their investment portfolio. Terribly boring job, but we got some interesting stuff out of it. And what we found, looking at literally about 1,000 company reports, many companies are referring to the Sustainable Development Goals. They're taking them quite seriously, certainly the more responsible ones. And they're choosing the SDGs that they focus on. One of the things we noticed was that SDG 14 and SDG 15, which are the ones directly related to biodiversity, are often omitted. And we're also seeing a change of attitude among governments, particularly after the last G7, among companies and governments, particularly after the last G7 meeting when biodiversity was highlighted. Companies are recognizing they need to take this much more seriously than they have. They're looking for advice. They're looking for a way forward. The SDGs provide them with a vehicle because many of them are already using SDGs as they relate to climate change or as they relate to energy recycling. And so there's an opportunity for us to work with them and integrate biodiversity within their thinking much more. Same is true for governments. And protected and conserved areas are the main vehicle to do that. So the report that we're talking about today involved many different groups: the Institute for European Environmental Policy, which was Mariana's old organization, IUCN, the Nature Conservancy, the World Bank, Wildlife Conservation Society, UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, and WWF. So really a big group of quite disparate organizations came together and looked at how the role of protected and conserved areas contribute to sustainable development goals, not only through biodiversity conservation, but also through nature-based solutions, natural solutions, the use of natural ecosystems to provide societal benefits, and a broader range of social objectives. What I'm going to do for most of the rest of my time is talk through what we found. And if you download the report, it's freely available. You'll see we did a general overview about what the challenges were for each particular SDG, how effective area-based conservation can help, and some of the approaches that support that particular sustainable development goal. So the way we manage protected areas, where we site them, how we address them, what kind of management plans we bring in will influence how they react to sustainable, each particular sustainable development goal. And then we also, for each SDG, have a series of case studies. And many more organizations got involved in supplying case studies. So this really was a multi-organizational process. So we basically found that there was direct links to about 11 sustainable development goals. And we divided those into three different types. There's the basic cornerstones of conservation and the underpinnings of prosperity: life below water, life on land. These are our targets as conservationists. And clearly they're important not only for biodiversity, but also because they underpin a lot of the life support services that many other of the SDGs depend on. Then we have fundamentals of well-being, hunger, water, climate. And then finally, a long list of other issues that are important for sustainable and healthy societies. And so protected areas, protected and conserved areas are critical for life below water, critical for life on land. They're, I think, pretty universally recognized as the cornerstone of conservation policies. They're not the only thing, of course. We can't protect all biodiversity within protected areas, but they're the bedrock in which we base a lot of our conservation planning. Very, very important. And so that's why most of us got into this. It's very clear. They're also really important for many of the provisioning or regulating ecosystem services. Zero hunger, they protect a lot of crop wild relatives. Many of the more cultural landscapes, which include living communities, protect traditional forms of agriculture, where biodiversity is closely related to it, where by having a protected area also it can support that type of traditional land use. Protected areas, protected watersheds like the one in this picture, also help keep water clean. Many major cities, many small towns rely on forested watersheds in particular, but also grassland, some other savanna types, to keep water clean, often much cheaper than doing a major sanitation program. And they're increasingly recognized for their role in climate action through storing and sequestering carbon. What we also found was that they have wider roles that often aren't recognized. Things like gender equality. We had quite a kickback when we started talking about this in the report. Even some of our partners said you know, we're pushing too far, or pushing the analogy too far. But you know, what we found was that in many countries where there is serious gender inequality, the fact that it's a protected area in a region, often quite a rural, traditional region, and women working as managers, as the senior staff, that's really quite unusual. It's bringing a new way of looking at gender into a society, and it has impacts within that society. Protected areas are important as places to exercise. The way that we manage them, if we address equality within the protected area itself, within the people living in and around it, then we provide a model. We provide a working model for other parts of society. And peace parks, protected areas set up in conflict zones as a way of building peace have been very, very important in some of the more troubled parts of the world. So we found many SDGs are directly linked to the benefits, but achieving these often means conscious management decisions. So it's making it more complicated. In a way, we're making our jobs more complicated, because we're going to have to look at things we haven't looked at before. Managers are bringing new issues into their management plans, and it's quite challenging for them. Also brings different protected area types into prominence. And sometimes this can be sort of counterintuitive. Some of the most strictly protected areas in the world, where people literally aren't allowed to go inside, are protected because they're also sacred natural sites for the local community and highly important for their particular faith group. The protected area can provide a legislative vehicle for providing that kind of protection. It also means many of what we call protected landscapes and seascapes, IUCN Category 5 protected areas with living communities within them, brings those into prominence because they provide a way of really balancing conservation and sustainable development. But so far, and I think it's one of the things we also recognize, these links are really not seen outside the conservation community, or not seen anything like widely enough. So one of the things we're going to be encouraging people to do, protected areas to do, is to report against their SDGs. And you can see, you can't read it, you can see we've done sort of things for a couple of protected areas within the case studies that we looked at, looking at how their management impacts on different sustainable development goals. And we're encouraging more protected areas to do that, so they can then report to the governments. And governments are all trying to report against the SDGs. So any way that we can give them easy ammunition for them to go back to the UN, they're going to be grateful. And this is a real opportunity for protected area managers, protected area supporters to make the case that the protected area has a much wider range of values than just nature conservation. Lake Skadar in the background there on the Albania-Montenegro border is incredibly important as a source of local fishing. And we had a workshop there a few years ago talking with local fishing groups about that. I've also just done the same for the local nature reserve that we live in Wales, Biosphere Reserve. It's quite easy to do, and I think would provide real arguments for the wider role of protected areas. But obviously this comes down to the people who have to manage the protected areas. And with this, I'm going to hand over to you, Mariana, to say something about the role of rangers. And you're going to have to tell me when to move the slides on.
Will do. Thank you, Nigel. And indeed, slightly confusingly, I'm going to step out of my moderator's role briefly to talk a little bit about one of the key players in this publication, or in this guidance that Nigel and I helped to put together, and we've been now talking about during this presentation. So, as Nigel said, we have to look at things differently in order to make broader audiences understand the role that protected and conserved areas play. And that also means that we have to look at slightly differently the players that we have in this protection conservation game that we perhaps have thought quite narrowly in the past. So during the pandemic, there has been a lot of discussion and increased appreciation of the term essential or key workers in our societies, including doctors, nurses, teachers, and those, for example, in public transport. And if you start to think of it, this key workers concept is also very applicable when we talk about sustainability agenda. So what I mean by this is, if you want to be serious about the 2030 agenda and achieving it, we should be much more explicitly identifying who are those essential workers that implement sustainable solutions in practice and help to deliver SDGs on the ground. So from that follows the question, whom do we need to equip to do the job? And whom do we need to listen to learn what is actually going on in practice? So obviously in the context of protected areas and conserved areas, rangers are one of those key worker groups. Not the only one, but certainly one of them. So when you hear the day-to-day job description of rangers around the world, it becomes very clear that they do not only manage habitats and species in conserved and protected areas, they also help to manage the relationship between local communities and these areas. And in doing so, they support the local communities in many aspects of sustainable resources use and wider sustainability. So, for example, in many areas of the world, rangers have the role of first responders to emergencies such as wildfires and flooding. During the pandemic, we've seen as well that rangers have taken up the role of healthcare practitioners. They're raising the awareness of COVID-19 in rural areas and also help to mitigate the spread of the virus, including spread of the virus to protected wildlife in their areas. And more broadly, and if you really think it through, when rangers help us to conserve forests and other ecosystems, they also at the same time are helping to conserve the global carbon storage and sinks. So in this way, actively working to mitigate climate change. So these are just a few examples of the much broader set of duties rangers are doing around the world on a daily basis. And the problem is that these wider roles of rangers are often informal and they are unacknowledged. And in general, rangers continue to be underpaid, they are not adequately equipped, and they're also insufficiently trained to do all these different duties that actually fall on them in day-to-day practice. So this affects the ability of the rangers to carry on their jobs successfully and also puts their lives on risk. So because of that, and now Nigel, could you give me another slide, please? There we go. Now I can see the other slide. So because of that, and again, I really am emphasizing this point that if we want to be serious with achieving the sustainability goals by 2030, we need to start recognizing the role of these essential workers, including rangers. And we need to bring them to the table where things are being discussed, decided, and consider them as key partners in delivering SDGs in practice. And in order to do that, we need to understand the rangers' needs. We need to understand and feed these needs and insights and lessons learned into the protected area management plans and working with protected areas, conserved areas, but also wider policies, for example, including policies that deal with sustainable labor. And finally, it's really important that we also look at establishing mechanisms for stable and long-term funding for rangers, because that is what ensures that we have rangers in a longer term in the profession and retaining them in their jobs. Nigel, can I have another slide, please? So this slide is here just to remind us that when we think about rangers as essential workers in the conservation and SDGs context, it'll be important to keep in mind that the rangers is an umbrella term for very different kind of key workers around the world who are facing different kinds of tasks and conditions in their daily lives. And these differences obviously need to be reflected in the engagement and support that we will be hopefully offering in the rangers more in the future. And interestingly, in this context, one of the increasing types of rangers are the community rangers, like on the left top of the slide, where we have some community rangers in Cameroon trying to suss out how their new equipment to support gorilla conservation will work. So community rangers, as name indicates, are members of the local communities who take up ranger roles and duties. And this, of course, is a great in terms of helping conservation activities to really build on the needs and interests and knowledge of local communities. So just to say, really, rangers are quite a broad group of different kinds of people, stakeholders that work in the conservation space around project areas. Final slide, please, Nigel. So this is just to highlight some key players that support and try to bring Rangers' agenda forward in currently and also much more in the future when we move towards, also the new biodiversity framework for 2030. So just, some names and organizations there that you might want to make a note of and follow as well. But with that, Nigel, do you have any concluding remarks before we move on? No. So that was the first presentation. Thank you, and also thank you for the comments and questions in the chat and QA box. But before we take a look at those more closely, I would quite like to now hand over to Mary Fishburn. So Mary, the floor is now yours. So if you could kindly briefly introduce yourself and also then tell us about the Panorama website and the related SDG publication.
Sure, thanks, Marianne, and hello, everybody. On my side as well, give me just a moment to bring up the presentation. Okay, I hope you can see that now.
Yes.
Great, thanks. So my name is Marie Fishburn. I'm with IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, working on protected and conserved areas, based in headquarters, and also coordinate the Panorama initiative that I'll briefly talk about, which is a learning and knowledge sharing initiative covering a number of topics, including protected and conserved areas. Mainly, so I will introduce some findings from a peer-reviewed IUCN publication that we launched last year, titled Solutions for Development Challenges, Insights from Protected and Conserved Areas. But before I do that, before I get to the publication, let me just say a few words about Panorama, as it's quite important for background to the publication itself. So Panorama, Solutions for a Healthy Planet, facilitates knowledge management, exchange, and learning from existing solutions. And by solutions, we mean not necessarily nature-based solutions, even though many of the Panorama solutions are examples of NBS, of nature-based solutions, but rather what we mean are just good practice examples, examples of what has worked in conservation and sustainable development. These are then being documented as case studies and are being broken down into their key success factors, what we sometimes call the building blocks of a solution, to support replication and uptake of elements of successful approaches. It's very much about supporting peer-to-peer exchange, and we have a strong focus on practitioners, so really the people working on the ground or at maximum 1 or 2 levels up, so those designing new conservation projects and initiatives. Panorama is a partnership, a quite diverse group of partners, 10 at present, including IUCN, who is very strongly involved. And you can see all the logos there on the slide. And it covers a wide range of topics across also 10 so-called communities, Panorama communities, including one on protected and conserved areas. So those are really the thematic areas of Panorama. And over half of the solutions that we have at present actually relate to protected areas. Last year, we surpassed the milestone of 1,000 solutions, which come from around 120 countries and have been submitted by around 800 individual solution providers from NGOs, but also government institutions, academic institutions, and others. And we broker this knowledge that's contained in the case studies through our web platform, of course, but also through workshops and other types of learning events, webinars, and then publications, which brings me to this particular publication, And the rationale for this was really this realization that we've just heard about, that of course conservation of species and ecosystems is always the primary objective of protected areas. Per definition, that's what they're being set up to do. But in addition, they also provide important benefits to society by maintaining ecosystem services. And by the way, for the publication, we also looked at these so-called conserved areas, so sites that do achieve conservation outcomes, even if that's not the primary management aim. We found that the Sustainable Development Goals are a really useful framework for analysis of Panorama solutions. And so that's what we used as a framework. And also another reason for embarking on this effort was that the idea of looking at trends across the Panorama solutions portfolio and bringing out common insights across the solutions is something that we're very interested in and that we'd like to expand. And this publication was really a pilot effort in terms of developing a methodology for doing this. So then on methodology, just very quickly, I'll explain what we did. So a first step was to actually understand and define which societal benefits and in consequence, which SDGs are of particular interest in the context of this publication, which was based on insights from the literature. In a second step, we then created a short list of solutions that are most relevant to the topic of the publication. So we didn't work with all of the protected and conserved area solutions from Panorama, but prioritized. Then we assigned solutions to SDGs in terms of what is at the core of their impacts, and we created clusters. And for doing that, we really looked at the full scope and the specific intention of each SDG, which is evidenced by the targets. So really trying to understand what the SDG is actually about beyond the short form headline, like no poverty or zero hunger. And then we actually embarked on the actual synthesis within each of these SDG clusters, as well as across them. So for example, we also looked at marine versus terrestrial solutions and analyzed the patterns and trends between parameters that describe the context from which the solution arose. So things like the ecosystem or the region in which it was applied or the challenges that it addressed. Then parameters relating to the process of the solution's operation. So these building blocks, these key components of the process, as well as parameters relating to impacts, including beneficiaries. All the information for this analysis was extracted directly from the Panorama platform based on the published case study text. And we ended up looking at 106 individual case studies across 8 SDGs, which you see here on the slide, that we examined in more detail. Now, I will not have time to go into any level of detail, of course, on the findings. I encourage you to read the report for that, but I will share some highlights. So one key message really that came out is that protected areas already contribute to all of the SDGs, every single one, of course, to some more than to others. But you can see here in the graph the number of solutions that make a contribution to each of the SDGs. And of course, typically, these solutions are quite complex projects or initiatives, so they touch on several of the SDGs. So the numbers here add up to more than 106, which is the total number of case studies that were included. But they're relevant to all SDGs. And this is a point that IUCN and others have been making for quite some time, as Nigel also outlined. But the solutions are really evidence that underlines that. Now, to which SDGs do the solutions contribute the most? Of course, unsurprisingly, all of them have an impact on either SDG 15, life on land, or SDG 14, life below water, given that the primary objective of protected areas is to preserve life on land and below water. So we had 85 solutions relating to SDG 15 and 50 relating to SDG 14 on water. SDG 13 on climate also features very prominently, with about half of the solutions contributing to it, which highlights again the important role of well-conserved nature for climate adaptation mitigation. Perhaps more surprising was the finding that SDG 17 on partnerships is also among the frontrunners. This SDG is sometimes perceived to be quite a mixed bag of aims around finance, capacity building, and other issues. But our finding really underlines that protected area management processes have advanced a lot for protected areas to be enablers of multi-stakeholder partnerships at site level. So bringing together actors that share an interest in the site and its values, such as tourism operators, academia, and strengthening these relationships and fostering collaboration between these actors. Also, about half of the solutions contribute to SDG 8 on employment, and a few less to SDG 1 on no poverty, which is closely linked. And most of the solutions that have goal 8, employment at the core, describe successful ecotourism models. And ecotourism can really be a powerful driver of local development, while at the same time creating incentives for preserving the natural values of the area, which is what attracts the visitors. And creating employment and poverty alleviation often go hand in hand. So we had a lot of the same solutions that were relevant to SDG 1 and SDG 8. A more overarching observation on the process of many of these solutions is that often success was achieved through careful engagement of a broad group of people over more extended periods of time, allowing for flexibility throughout all stages of implementation. And another overarching theme that emerged is that getting conservation right means really first getting contextual governance and social and economic issues right. So in concluding, let's recall that the relationships between the various SDGs are not particularly straightforward. There are tensions between the so-called social and the environmental goals, and often there's a need to negotiate trade-offs between two or more legitimate but competing demands. So pressure for economic growth and so-called development has often undermined attempts to achieve other aims such as gender equality or responsible consumption, and certainly has caused a lot of environmental problems. But on the other hand, I think what this analysis really demonstrates is that coordinated responses offer a chance to address several SDGs at once. And a beautiful example for that is mangrove restoration, which is a conservation priority, and it relates to both SDGs 14 and 15, as mangroves are at the interface between land and water. But mangrove restoration also makes a contribution to SDG 13 on climate, because they store carbon and provide coastal protection against storm surges, and also help to build and maintain fish stocks, which can be seen as a contribution to SDG 2 on zero hunger. The findings of our report, so the finding that protected areas contribute positively to the achievement of all SDGs, also strengthens their relevance, of course, and provides additional arguments for their further expansion, which is the cause of much debate right now in relation to the proposed new global 30 by 30 target. And then a final point is on the importance of quality. So protected areas can only deliver on human development benefits along with their conservation benefits if good governance processes are in place. So to close, I'd like to say that these solutions are really evidence from the field. There are, of course, some limitations and caveats to Panorama and to this particular exercise. But overall, this summary of over 100 real implemented examples is quite powerful. The report is available as a free download on the IUCN website, and I'll also put the link in the chat. And thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marie. And it's, as you said, Panorama is really, truly a very useful, remarkable resource. And we also, thanks to you and in cooperation with you, used it in our guidance that, Nigel just presented. So, it is also already integrated in there. But just a couple of things from your presentation and linking it, to what Nigel said earlier. What I picked up complementing and really interestingly was that, firstly, your set of SDGs extended our looked at key set of SDGs broader. So showing that, when you think it perhaps from a slightly different angle, or when you look at the interlinkages from one SDG or another, you end up, for example, with much broader set of SDGs like contributions of project and conserved areas to sustainable and good jobs, as you said, and employment, and also to the whole set of SDG 17, which is in the space of financing and cooperation and partnerships as well. They do, just to say, they do also feature in the guidance that Nigel was talking about as additional SDGs building on our core set of SDGs. But now we kind of have between these two presentations, the whole set, which, as Marie concluded, seems to be all the SDGs are linked to, positively linked to protected and conserved areas. And one other thing which is important and interesting from what Marie said was the trade-offs. And I hope that, we can also talk about that maybe in the discussions a bit later in one of our Q&A sessions. So I invite Nigel, for example, to reflect on that, because obviously it would be nice to think that, there wouldn't be some decisions have to be made between whether you deliver towards one SDG or another. But as a whole, I think the message is from, both of the presentations this morning that one can find compromises and one can certainly deliver multiple SDGs together while conserving the nature for SDGs 14 and 15 as well. But with that short sort of recap and putting things into context and reflecting both of these presentations as your moderator, let's just have a bit of a chat with our audience next. So one question that has been popping up and conversation has been had around private protected areas, PPAs. So in addition to what's been already in the chat and people can read, Nigel, would you be willing to reflect a little bit about, private protected areas' role in this whole context, and also perhaps, where they are at the moment in a broader set of conserved and protected areas and how they're featuring there? Are they trending and what their future role might be?
Thanks, Mariana. Privately protected areas are really interesting. They're a growth area. If you look at a global scale, they're tiny compared to state protected areas, but they're often in places where state protected areas don't work, would have difficulty getting in place. I mean, they're growing quickly. Some countries like South Africa are putting a big emphasis on them. Of course, they're much more flexible than many government protected areas because they are controlled by one individual or often by a charitable trust. And they're also quite quick. States move fairly slowly often. So getting a national park designated will take decades often. Whereas if a landowner decides to convert their land to a protected area, they can do it immediately. If there's a critical bit of habitat at risk and there's enough money to buy it, you can do it like that. So a flexible and very strategically used element. And I think they are going to be quite interesting with the SDGs because we say privately protected areas rather than private protected areas nowadays, because the large majority are open to the public. They're public goods, but owned by individuals or trusts or companies. And so, privately protected looking to their wider role within society, often relying to some extent on grant money as well. So yeah, key role to play, very important.
Fantastic, thanks Nigel on that reflection. Then I have an important and perhaps even slightly difficult question, but very important opponent, which is about the role of rangers, as we discussed, but also highlighting that we know there have been incidences around negative side of this, so human rights abuses associated with militarized law enforcement and relationship with the local communities. So on that, Nigel, I also know that you are together with Sue working on this space at the moment. So maybe I can invite you to reflect on that, and maybe can add to it later. And Marie as well, maybe on the Rangers side, do you happen to have from the Panorama experience some links to the community rangers that you might be able to share as well, or direct people to as a group of rangers working more closely and as a part of the community? But Nigel, first maybe to you to reflect.
Sure, no, it's a good question. It came from Melodidi, I think. And Susan Canny's already made a response online. Look, yeah, it's serious. I mean, in some ways, it's getting worse because the poaching crisis of the last decade has, first of all, it's put many rangers under risk. We've had 1,000 rangers die on the job in the last decade. So it's in some places become a high risk profession, but then that's also resulted in increasing militarization, both within ranger communities and direct use of armies to control this. And clearly in some places, a kind of unofficial shoot to kill policy, and then many other abuses going around with that. What can we do about it? I mean, Sue, as Mariana said, Sue and I have been involved in working with a number of the big NGOs looking at their safeguarding policies. And people are very aware of this. So trying to put more safeguards in place for their own policies of checking what's happening more carefully, demanding certain level of training with rangers. So there's that on one side, and for governments and big NGOs and donors that are providing money, getting their own safeguarding policies in place. I think there's a lot we can do in terms of ranger training. I mean, rangers are often, it's kind of it's the bottom of the pile quite often of where you get. It's not a high profile job. And you find people with very little level of training, completely out of their depth, often moved around the country. So they're in a place where they have no links with the community. And in some places very powerful, and that's not necessarily good for people. So I think abuses come with power often. So a lot of work with rangers, and in the big survey of rangers done in the last couple of years ago, 500 rangers interviewed around the world, social relations came out as their biggest challenge. So many rangers, the Spartan rangers, all know they've got a problem and are trying to work on that. So a lot of work in terms of simple things like conflict resolution, but also community relations, building trust. And then on top of that, once you've got that, you can do things like places to report abuse, safeguarding systems. But I think those kind of add-ons will only work if you've got a certain level of trust. I think there's also, in some cases, and we've just started as WCPA, World Commission on Protected Areas, we just started talking with the World Commission on Environmental Law about this. There's more guidance needed about legal systems. Often we find rangers struggling to enforce legal systems they don't really agree with themselves. You know, maybe in many of the tropical countries, they're still basically set up during the colonial period, and they're no longer fit for purpose if they ever were. They're certainly not fit for purpose today. And so I think IUCN and groups like that should be giving advice to governments about the type of legal framework you need that brings in things like free, prior, informed consent, proper safeguarding policy, and proper policies about rangers. But it's a good question, and it's not going to be easy to fix. We'll see other problems before it gets better, but I think there's lots of things we can do. Back to you, Mariana.
Thanks, Nigel. Indeed, it's two key spaces to work on, which is the training awareness space with the rangers, working with the rangers and the communities. But also, I'm glad that you pointed out that there's also the higher, element where rangers have less influence themselves, which is about the governance framework within which they work, which then advocacy organizations and working with governments and highlighting perhaps the role of rangers in a positive way helps to create a better functioning, supportive and positive framework within which they which they work, and also helps with that community engagement, hopefully. But as I said, Marie, do you have any concrete examples, perhaps with the community rangers, with the thinking here being that community rangers are obviously from the community and therefore feels like a nice and known to be nice linchpin between the community and the conservation. So any insights from you from there, or links to direct people to?
Yes, we have a couple of examples that include village rangers on Panorama. I can post some links again in the chat. I think what these examples showcase is that the village ranger model is really a way of obviously creating awareness and buy-in for conservation with the people who actually live in the place, who have a stake in the place, and to know the place extremely well, which also makes them very effective as rangers, because they simply have knowledge that a ranger who might have worked in another protected area at the other end of the country until 2 weeks ago just doesn't have. And at the same time, they create local employment, which again, it further increases buy-in for the protected area. So in the best of cases, it's really a win-win type of approach. I'll just very briefly mention two great examples that we have in Panorama. So one is from Armenia, the Caucasus Wildlife Refuge, which is a privately protected area, actually managed by a foundation, excuse me, and they are employing 6 rangers from the community who patrol the area. It's quite a large territory. They patrol it on a 24/7 regime, preventing any illegal activity, but also carrying out wildlife monitoring, for example. And it seems to be working really well. And it's actually the only project of this type in the entire southern Caucasus region. And the other example is a site in Laos, the Hinnam-No protected area, where also a system with the village rangers has been set up by GIZ in collaboration with the parks authorities. So it involves people from 19 villages, and a total of around 80 rangers, quite a large group. The site is quite inaccessible, so it's karst mountains, and it really requires this in-depth knowledge that these people from the community have to be able to, in order to be able to carry out effective patrolling. So I'll post these 2 links in the chat.
Fantastic, thanks, Marie. Looking at some other questions we have, and helpfully for me as a moderator, a question has been asked around the trade-offs, which I hope that we perhaps would be able to discuss as well more explicitly with you today. So the question is, are there any examples where project has had a negative impact on a specific SDG? So that's the question, but obviously I think maybe we can talk about this point more broadly as to what kind of trade-offs are the most common trade-offs perhaps between SDGs in conservation context, and also what can be done about it. So what kind of good practices do we have, and perhaps as well, if you want to be really thinking about this point and be more specific, do we think that there are some irreconcilable SDGs, that certain SDGs just don't work together? Having said that, though, I think Marie kind of gave us already an answer, because according to the Panorama database and analysis of that, it seemed that there are positive interactions between most of the cases. But I'm sure that perhaps there are certain SDGs that need more reconciling or more attention to detail while doing so. But around this point of trade-offs, thoughts from Nigel and Marie. Nigel, I'll give you the floor first, simply because then it gives Marie the time to think, since she was the last one to answer the previous question.
Thanks, Mariana. And I've been to that place in the Caucasus, Marie. Absolutely amazing, wonderful. Yeah, of course there'll be trade-offs. I think, of course, biodiversity conservation is a trade-off in that you don't use the land for other things, and that's a real cost. So you're not using it for food production, or not using it for or crop production in many cases. So there will be trade-offs. We need to be clear about that, which is one of the reasons why we need to make sure we've got arguments for protected areas as broadly as possible. I think one of the changes we're going to see with this extra expansion is that we're going to be asked more to look at other values, particularly in the case of other effective area-based conservation measures where biodiversity isn't necessarily the biggest priority. So, and the kind of things that we need to be aware of is, for example, the role of vegetation in capturing carbon sequestration to combat climate change. And there, yeah, I think there's real dangers within the UN Decade on Ecological Restoration, which we just started, of people rushing to establish forests, perhaps in areas where it's not actually the best, certainly not the best from a conservation point of view, and maybe not the best from other points of view. We're already finding in the UK, big finance bodies buying up farms and just putting them down to trees, which will be monocultures. They won't be any good for anything. So I think there's a lot to be careful about. But many of the ecosystem services we were talking about in the report depend on a functioning ecosystem, and therefore it's likely to be useful for many SDGs, not just one SDG. So they won't automatically be trade-offs, more a case of recognizing and managing for particular values. But we certainly do need to be aware, as soon as we start manipulating an ecosystem, we need to be very aware about what trade-offs there are. And as I say, I think this issue is going to be more and more important. And we're going to need to develop the types of tools and negotiating processes to handle that. And in some cases, make hard decisions. Over to you, Mary.
Great, thank you. Marie, reflections from you, please.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to very briefly show something, and I think is sort of the theory behind this question around trade-offs. This is a diagram. It's sometimes called the SDG Wedding Cake. And it's been developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center. And so what this illustrates is that the goals that relate to the biosphere dimension are really underpinning the other dimensions, the society and the economy dimension, so all the other goals. And we cannot achieve the other goals if we fail to maintain the integrity of the biosphere. Now, in practice, of course, trade-offs are unavoidable, and I don't think I have too much to add to what Nigel said, but maybe just to mention that some of the ecosystem services that are most critical on a global scale, like carbon storage or disaster risk reduction or water provision, are actually really compatible with protected area management objectives. But in practice, of course, especially between what we traditionally call human development, and that traditional understanding of what development entails often does clash with conservation objectives, and that then plays out in specific places such as protected areas, and there needs to be prioritization, there needs to be careful negotiation and reflection on these trade-offs involving all relevant actors at a site. And in some cases, at least in a protected area that's sufficiently large, zoning can also be part of the answer. So just allowing for different management objectives to have priority in different parts of the place.
Great, thank you, Marie. We're going to move on to Hannah next, so have our third presentation, but I thank Nigel and Marie already at this point. And Marie, just to direct you to the Q&A, there's a specific question for you there, if you don't mind picking it up and answering, which is related to your solutions, Panorama solutions, the overview of them, and particularly SDG 15. So I'll leave that for you to answer. But with that, I'd like to move on, and I will invite Hannah Timmins to take the floor and kindly introduce herself, and also then tell us about the recent report that she's been working on for the CBD around the topics of benefits of protected and conserved areas. So Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, Mariana. That's great. Thanks for the introduction. Lovely to be here speaking with you all today. So I'm Hannah. I'm an area-based conservationist and ecologist based in Nairobi, Kenya. I work predominantly between two groups, a small organization called the Forest Conservation Fund and Equilibrium Research, who many of you will be familiar with, aka Nigel Dudley and Sue Stolton, with whom I put together this report. The report is Sue will also be helping me a little bit with the slides and joining us hopefully for the Q&A after this session. So yeah, the report is Making Money Local: Can Protected Areas Deliver Both Economic Benefits and Conservation Objectives? So if we can move on to the second slide, please, Sue. Okay, so our aim with this report was to compile a taxonomy of case studies of realized cash in hand financial benefits of protected areas. So with the kind of fundamental goals of building a global constituency for conservation, support for conservation, also justifying the management costs of protected areas, and identifying realized economic benefits to local communities, and also coming up with a bit of a selection of potential creative ideas that other protected areas could use to financially benefit local communities. And the report itself has got all kinds of interesting stuff that Sue put together around connecting those different stakeholders, business, local communities, and protected area management. I won't go into that too much today. We wanted to showcase multiple biomes, continents, protected area categories, those beneficiaries as well, and different businesses too, to really get a good selection in there. We went about this by identifying case studies initially reaching out through our networks, and also via a desk-based research as well. And we finalized and crafted each of the case studies with contacts that were based working on those projects as well. So we really got a good feel for what was going on the ground. We really wanted to hit a sort of beautiful round number of 50. In the end, we got 36 case studies. And this was, for a number of different reasons. Firstly, and perhaps most interestingly, financial benefits of protected areas are often either not reported or are underreported or are reported inconsistently. And I think we've got Candace Stevens on next week to discuss this in a little bit more depth. So that's going to be quite an interesting talk. I definitely encourage you guys all to tune in for that. Secondly, many of the projected benefits, many of the financial benefits were often projected through like total economic value studies. So we wanted realized benefits that had already been providing cash in hand for communities. Some of the cases were once actually sustainable, but had eventually been overexploited. So there were all this wonderful reporting to begin with, and eventually we found out that actually they'd been overexploited and we'd lost those conservation objectives. We talked about trade-offs a little bit earlier, and that kind of touches on that. And lastly, in some cases, people just didn't respond, so we had to drop a few case studies there. And today we'll just give you a little whirlwind tour of about 6 of our 36 studies. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Sue. A whistle-stop tour. So this is where we're going, guys. This is 36 case studies across the world. As you can see, we've got loads of different continents in there. We've also got lots of different biomes, and you can tell that by the color of the drop pins. And on to the next slide, please, Sue. So here you can see a little bit of some of the statistics, some of the splits of our different case studies. We split them into 6 different categories of values that were identified. Tourism, perhaps unsurprisingly, was a huge feature, a lot of different case studies on tourism. I'm not going to touch on tourism today. I think Sybil also mentioned that in the chat, so perhaps that's something to discuss later on. But definitely go and check out the report for that. And in terms of IUCN protected area categories, protected category number 2, so those sort of national parks featured the majority of our financial benefits that we found. Thanks, Sue, that's great. So the first whistle-stop tour, we're in Madagascar. This is the Velondriac, apologies for my poor pronunciation, but I think it's Velondriac locally managed marine area. So Velondriac actually means to live with the sea in the local Malagasy language. And it supports one of the largest and most biologically diverse coral reef systems in the Western Indian Ocean. Of the 7,500 people living within this locally managed marine area, most of them are semi-nomadic Vezo people. So these are really highly dependent on the sea for food and transport and income, and even cultural identity as well, which is super important for them. It's also important economically. So the small-scale fisheries sector employs 87% of the adult population here and generates an average of 82% of all household income and provides the sole protein source in 99% of household meals. So really important, economically important for food. And since 2004, the local fishers here have been managing the octopus fisheries, in particular through customary laws known as DINA. And these include science-based rotational temporary closures of fishing grounds, so short-term bans on fishing areas, in specific reef areas. And because octopus is such a fast-growing species, even just closures of 2 to 7 months were allowing octopus populations to recover. And the average weight of octopus landed per fisher per day actually increased by 87% in the month after a reopening. And total landings increased by, fish landings increased by 718%. So just moving on to the next slide, please, Sue. Okay, so these increases in catch and average weight actually doubled village level income. And the opening period in particular was an important source of income for women because it actually happened during a neap tide when culturally women were able to go out and catch octopus by gleaning in the shallow water. So the amount of fish harvested in closures also, it generated more revenue than the amount of fish that would have been harvested if there were no closures. So the opportunity costs were forgone, catch covered by increased profits following temporary closures. Marie mentioned earlier the SDGs, and we've got some of the main badges here. Of course, as Marie said, most of these protected areas actually contribute to all the SDGs, or a majority of them. We just couldn't fit them on the slide, so I've chosen the most fundamental ones for these slides. Could we move to the next slide, please, Sue? Okay, great. So our next stop is in Fiji, the Weti Navakavu locally managed marine area. So the peninsula here is surrounded by coral reef and mangroves and remnants of coastal littoral forest, providing habitat for loads of different species and also protection against storm surges and erosion from frequent cyclones. So again, backing up those SDGs. And this locally managed marine area is the traditional fishing ground, or kwali kwali in the local language, of 4 villages, all really highly dependent on the fisheries, again, for income and for protein. And in 2002, responding to declines in fish catches, the communities actually set up themselves no-take zones with support from the Fiji locally managed marine area network and the University of the South Pacific. And here, all fishing and other extractive activities are prohibited, but most crucially, the spillover effects from those no-take zones now replenish fish stocks in the surrounding traditional fishing grounds. So moving on to the next slide, please, Sue. So during the 4 years after the establishment of these no-take zones, community fin fish catches alone increased by 3%. And the proportion of male fishers to female fishers is roughly 50-50. So important again for that gender equality SDG. 40% of the fish caught is actually consumed by the households themselves, and 60% is sold to generate $475 for the local communities each year. On average, this comes to just under $4,300 per household. So again, important for that zero hunger SDG as well. Just moving on to the next slide, please. Thanks, Sue. Yeah, okay, so our next stop is Sierra Leone Gola Forest Peace Parks. This is a trans-boundary protected area which unites the Gola Forest National Park in Liberia and the Gola Rainforest National Park of Sierra Leone. So these countries are 7th and 11th in the lowest GDPs in 2019, so important for that zero poverty SDG as well. And the ancient Upper Guinean tropical rainforest here is home to 330 species of birds, 650 species of butterflies, and nearly 50 species of mammals, which include chimpanzees, pygmy hippopotamuses, and forest elephants. But between 1988 and 2007, 23,000 kilometers of this forest was lost for clearance for cocoa farms. But now the farmers in the Gola area are practicing agroforestry, so shade-grown cocoa trees. I'm really sorry, I've had a bit of a cold recently, so apologies to keep coughing. So these are shade-grown cocoa trees that support connectivity and form a buffer zone to connect the different protected area blocks here. And the farmer associations here have also set up a cocoa farmer union producer. And this process has been a transparent, created a transparent, gender inclusive cocoa value chain, which is now seeing premium fair trade chocolate retailed in Europe, the USA, and even Japan as well. So if we can move, thank you, Sue. So between 2016 and 2019, 1,800 farmers here sold 56 metric tons of organic cocoa through the Cocoa Farmer Union producer. And at $2,900 per metric ton, those sales leveraged just over $160,000 for these communities. 60% of that was received by the farmers as income, and the remainder was then reinvested into the union producer itself. So moving on to the next slide, thank you, Sue. Our next stop is Australia, the Wardecken Indigenous Peoples Area. So Indigenous peoples areas in Australia cover 44% of Australia's national reserve system. So super important for the protected area state of this country for that 30 by 30. And along with the Australian government's Indigenous Ranger program, these provide employment for almost 3,000 Indigenous Australians across the nation in land and sea management. So Wardecken is actually owned by the Wardecken people and managed by the Indigenous owned Wardecken Land Management Limited. The area itself covers 3/4 of the Western Armand Plateau bioregion. So that's one of Australia's biodiversity hotspots. And the area also critically contains some really important cultural and rock art and archaeological sites as well. But like much of Australia, the Northern Territory and Wardecken suffers from low employment and high fire risk. And the Wardecken Land Management Limited's Indigenous Rangers are actually managing that fire risk, along with invasive species and monitoring threatened species. And the management of this fire risk is now generating income for the Wardecken Land Management Limited through the sale of carbon offsets from traditional fire management. So we can move on to the next slide. Thank you, Sue. So between 2009 and 2015, the Wardecken Land Management Limited generated an income of around $2.6 million from the sale of carbon offsets from traditional fire management. And this allowed them to employ 253 Indigenous peoples, of which 47% were women. And these were paid around US 2.3 million in gross salaries. The next slide, please, Sue. Okay, now we're on to Bangladesh, to the Lawachara National Park. Lawachara is actually named after one of the Kazia indigenous groups' villages that surround the park. And the area provides habitat for 266 species of birds, 50 mammals, including 60 critically endangered Western Hulock gibbons. The 30 villages, or punjis in the local language, that surround the park have been co-managing the area and protecting the park with the Bangladeshi Forest Department as well. And the Kazia depend on Lawachara National Park, the Kazia indigenous group, for a number of different non-timber forest products, including bamboo and fuelwood and wild vegetables and medicinal plants and all kinds of stuff. But also they rely really heavily on the trees themselves for the traditional practice of forest-based farming of betel leaves. So we may have some South Asians and Southeast Asians in the audience today, but for those of you who don't know, betel leaf is chewed as pan for its medicinal qualities, and it's chewed with betel nut and lime to flavor it. And the betel vine itself actually requires trees for support, and as such, the Kazia culturally, they never fell those trees in the allocated area of the park, but instead just prune the branches for fuel wood and for lumber. And on average, the Kazia households earn about $1,477 from betel sales each year. That's 71% of their annual income. 1 hectare of a betel agroforestry generates around $950 annually. Okay, and thank you, Sue. And for our last case study, we're just going to have a quick look at the Argentina's Peninsula Valdez World Heritage Site. So This area is home to guanacos and Darwin's rhea and pumas and all kinds of amazing South American wildlife. It's also an important food source and stopover for more than 20,000 birds and a regular stopover for a critically endangered subspecies of red knot. But the nature reserve itself, the management has been successfully protecting the coastal wildlife. But most of the steppe is actually privately owned by ranchers. So coming back, I think, to Sybil's point on privately owned protected areas. In fact, here, sadly, falls in wool prices combined with decreases in productivity of the land due to pervasive overgrazing and severe droughts really damaged livelihoods historically. And this then caused conflicts between the ranchers and wild predators and herbivores, and led to persecution of that wildlife and habitat loss and connectivity loss as well. But actually, 6 ranchers operating inside the reserve came together to form the Merino Peninsula de Valdez group and committed to achieving coexistence between sheep farming and wildlife. And they created a sustainable grazing management plan that decreased herd stocking rate and also permitted the non-lethal control of predators and guanacos through things like guardian dogs. And these ranches produce up to 8,000 kilograms of fine merino wool per year, bought at $6 per kilo. That fetches $48,000 per ranch annually. And these ranchers have also invested in a wool processing facility. So there's a bit of an experiment going on to improve their value chain and their traceability. And this processed wool has fetched up to $22 per kilogram in Buenos Aires and could generate up to $180,000 per ranch per year. And in 2016, as you saw from the last slide, this wool has now been certified as wildlife friendly. So that's the end of this, our little whistle-stop tour. And thanks to everyone for listening to this, and to those people who also supported the study and provided all the images. Report will be shared in the chat, and credit information and much more information can be found in the report. So I really encourage you guys to have a little look at that. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And thank you for bringing us perfectly to something more concrete. So basically, of looking at SDGs in a more theoretical way and providing the framework from the previous presentations, looking at actually concrete sites and concrete benefits in terms of quantifiable benefits as well. I hope that this has been very useful and interesting, and also how would I say, very logical continuum for our listeners to follow. But we still have a few minutes left in our webinar, and a question has been asked. What about using this information and this thinking to try to attract some private capital towards the protected and conserved areas? Any thoughts on that regard? And I'm going to open this now for all of the panelists, whether you have any thoughts or comments on this. So we all know that resource mobilization for protected and conserved areas is a big thing, and we also know that we need those resources for them to actually work with the local communities and deliver these benefits to SDGs. So how can we get the money in, and how can we attract perhaps also private capital? So any thoughts? Please put your hand up or just unmute yourselves and help yourselves with the floor. Otherwise, I'll have to assign you. Sue has her hand up, so I'm going to give over to Sue first.
Okay, I better say something. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Sue Stolton. I'm also part of Equilibrium Research and helped lead the research on the CBD report. Yes, private capital, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I think one of the things that we showed in the CBD report is that in some cases, protected areas can still conserve biodiversity, but produce a product. And there are various sort of certification systems. Organic certification system is one. Wildlife friendly is this very specific certification system for places, particularly where we're looking at coexistence between predators. And they help local people to produce something and then find a market. Nigel and I, a very long time ago, used to work on the organic agriculture movement, and there are tensions there, because you're also looking often at products that need to be exported to richer Western markets. So then you're looking at food miles, and also markets can collapse if projects don't get there in time or in a good condition or in certain sort of sizes and weights. But there are that level of production. Obviously, you know, we covered tourism in the report where private money can come in, but there is a need for really working out how we can fund the benefits that maybe people might have lost through protected areas, this trade-offs. And you know, one of the types of funding that's in early days, but is some kind of sort of social impact investment, where people want to invest in something that provides social benefits as well as financial benefits. And I think in the future we might see that kind of social investment benefits linked far more to protected areas that can prove that they are being effective both in conserving biodiversity, but importantly in conserving social and cultural norms. So I shall shut up there and see if anybody else wants to say anything.
Thanks, Sue. Anyone else with any further thoughts or additional comments to Sue's thoughts? Nigel.
Sure. I think the other point is that the pressure to do this is growing all the time. So we need to get it right. I think we can bring in private money. I think there are options to do that. We're just doing some work for the UK DEFRA, the UK government, on steps to implementing the 30 by 30 target. And they asked us 10 questions, 9 of which included cost effective within it. Which on the one hand is quite depressing because that's, you know, where government thinking is coming from. But the other hand, I understand why they're doing that, because we are talking about a real paradigm shift. That's an overused term. You know, the majority of the world's protected areas have been set up in the lifetime of the majority of people on this call. You know, it's a very quick change, and we're talking about an even bigger change. I can't think of another example in human history where we've consciously changed land management aims over such an area so quickly. So we're going to have to be really canny about that. And you know, one of the things about companies really recognizing some of those issues in relation to biodiversity means that there's an opening for raising money from places that weren't there before. So I think it's something we've got to wrestle with. We don't know anything like enough about it now. We'll be talking about some of those problems next week, but very, very important to get our heads around.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. And also just to pick up your point on the companies and private financing through, you know, business involvement. My understanding is that, you know, the payments for ecosystem services, which we have been talking about, you know, for would it be now a couple of decades even, that, you know, some of them do actually work, and, you know, and there are certainly mechanisms that allow the private side and private business side also to be part of this. For example, when one thinks about, you know, water retention and water purification type of services, among other things. Hannah or Mary, any comments here? You can just also shake your heads if not, so then we'll move on. Anything add? Great. So we have 5 minutes left, and that's not a lot, but what I would like to do, if all my panelists, and now Sue, I include you in this as well, if you agree, is to do a quick round table, one thought as to, based on these insights and thoughts that we have presented for our listeners, would you have like one takeaway message or one recommendation or one source that they would be looking at, you know, the next that, you know, we would get the ball rolling? For example, in terms of, you know, when thinking about their work in the 2030 context for biodiversity, Global Biodiversity Framework. So if I may, I know this is a bit of a surprise, but, you know, it's always nice to kind of have everybody's voices at the end. So I reckon you will be able to do this for us. So I'll hand over, maybe Nigel, I'm going to put you in the spot first, and then, you know, Marie, then Hannah, and then Sue. So one takeaway message for our listeners, please.
Thanks, Mariana. My takeaway message would be, we need to talk to different stakeholders. We need to go out and talk to, you know, some of the people we've traditionally seen as enemies, maybe, or you know, not interested in conservation, big companies, and I think the door door's a little bit open. We need to push it open, but we're not going to do this on our own. So we need to be widening our group.
Thanks, Nigel. So widen the group, talk to different stakeholders. Marie, what about you?
Yeah, I think things are shifting, and there is really an opportunity increasingly in terms of the debate and the global policy processes around this, with development and environment, so climate and biodiversity, no longer necessarily being seen as opposing each other, but really one supporting the other. And that idea is really now landing in the mainstream. We've seen that again with the Glasgow conference, and the SDGs themselves were an early example of that sort of thinking. So I'm optimistic in terms of where things are heading.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marie. Optimism is always needed and welcomed. Hannah, what are your thoughts?
I think I'm just going to build on Murray's optimism, really. I think focusing in on the financial stuff that Sue and I have been looking at, I think those win-win-win situations for business communities and conservation are out there. And yeah, we can find them. I think it's about being creative, and it's about ensuring that those conservation values aren't lost along that way. But yeah, I think they're out there, and we need to stay positive.
Yeah, and also, we've certainly seen evidence through yours and Sue's work, and also everybody else's work around this table, that they can work, which is should really convince us and others that this can be done. Sue, what about you? Final words.
Well, I mean, Nigel and I have been working on what we kind of broadly term arguments for protected areas for about 25 years now, trying to pull together in different ways and in different formats the kind of wider arguments, obviously always taking the step back that conservation and biodiversity conservation is the primary aim. But we still find it challenging to find good examples, and Hannah said how we did for this report. And one of the reasons that we find it challenging is that everybody tends to report on things in different ways and in different formats, and Panorama is fantastic because we had, I don't know, Marie, I think there's sort of 1,000 or so things on Panorama now, but I think for you, for Panorama, and certainly for us, trying to draw lessons across a wide range of case studies is really difficult when everybody is using different ways of reporting. So I'm sort of partly saying that to plug, same time, same place next week, because we're going to be looking at that a bit. But I mean, we're only going to be touching on that next week. And I think it's still something that the conservation community needs to get its act together a bit more in, not only doing great conservation, but in telling great conservation stories. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sue. And that's obviously also a lovely cliffhanger for the next week's webinar. But with that, it is really time to say thank you to all the speakers, panelists, presenters today. Thank you so much. And also thank you to our host, the Vital Sites at IUCN. And obviously, of course, thank you to the audience. There were quite a number of you today, which is fantastic, around the world, and also asking questions and chatting and saying hi to you, hi to us and one another in the chat. So it was lovely to have you here in the virtual space today. So I hope you have found the discussions interesting. I hope you've gotten some food for thought to look things differently and more holistically in the future, and also already concrete resources and references for your work. And hopefully also this has left you keen to learn more, including the second webinar that comes next week. It will be at the same time, also on Wednesday, so that will be 23rd of February. And that webinar will really pick up from where we left things today. So highlight practical tools and guidances, how you actually go about assessing and accounting for the different benefits that we have discussed today and showed examples of. And you particularly will be hearing about a tool called Protected Area Benefits Assessment Tool, PA-BAT for short, for those who've been using it. And it's a participatory approach that helps you to identify the economic and non-economic benefits that are linked to these protected and conserved areas. So you'll be hearing from people who've actually used them, and you'll be able to quiz people also who've been using them and how to take things forward in practice. So hope you feel inspired. Hope you also feel better prepared. And this will all, in the end, help you to link area-based conservation to the wider sustainability agenda, and also, as Sue highlighted, report accordingly, so we'll get the evidence and we get those stories going. So with that, I say thank you as well, and I hand over to Ruchir to close and also tell everybody where to find the recording for this particular webinar when it's available. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marianne, and thank you everyone who has taken part today, the panelists and attendees from around the world. Just a little reminder, this was part 1 of a 2-part series. So if you'd like to register for part 2, it's on the screen here, and I've dropped the link in the chat. We will also send you a follow-up email through Eventbrite with the recording of this session and a reminder of the link for part 2. So with that, thank you everyone for making this event such a pleasant experience and a success. And we look forward to hosting you again at the same time next Wednesday, the 23rd of February.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.